Begin. Silas lived by the wide, winding river. His small cabin, built from rough logs, nestled close to the water's edge. He wasn't a young man anymore, his hands gnarled from years of setting traps and pulling in nets. But even in his old age, Silas found comfort in the river's song. Each night, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery colors, he would sit on his porch. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the bank, the chirping of crickets, and sometimes the soft hoot of an owl. He didn't talk much, not even to himself. His days were spent mending old fishing lines, whittling small wooden figures, or simply watching the currents flow by. People in the nearby town knew Silas as the riverman. They said he understood the water better than anyone, that he could tell what the weather would do just by looking at how the river moved. He often fished at night, his lantern a tiny star bobbing on the dark surface, pulling in supper with practiced ease. The river was his friend, his provider, and his quiet companion. It held many secrets, and Silas, in his own way, held a few of his own. Begin. One evening, the familiar quiet of the river changed. Dark clouds, thick and heavy, rolled in from the west. The air grew still, then a fierce wind began to howl, making the tall pines near Silas's cabin bend and sway. Lightning flashed, tearing across the sky, followed by thunder that shook the very ground. Rain began to fall, not in gentle drops, but in sheets, turning the dirt path to mud and blurring the river's edge. This was no ordinary storm. It was a beast of wind and water. Silas watched from his window, a flicker of concern in his eyes. He knew what a storm like this meant for the river. All through the night, the rain poured down, and the river, usually so calm, began to churn and roar. By morning, the water had risen high, covering the banks and rushing with frightening speed. The old wooden bridge, a few miles upstream that connected the town to the other side, groaned under the pressure. Suddenly, with a loud crack that echoed down the valley, the bridge gave way. Its timbers splintered, and parts of it were swept downstream. Not long after, a large, flat-bottomed boat, heavily loaded with goods and meant for the town store, broke free from its moorings upstream. It crashed against some hidden rocks, getting stuck fast in the swollen river, its cargo now trapped and helpless against the powerful currents. Begin. As the morning light grew stronger, Silas stepped outside his cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, but also a river that was a muddy, raging beast. He walked along the bank, his eyes scanning the water, and soon he saw it, the stranded boat. It was wedged tight between two jagged rocks, its sides scraped and battered, its cargo clearly visible and in danger of being swept away by the fierce current. Silas knew that boat. It carried supplies the town needed badly, especially with the bridge gone. Most folks would just shake their heads and say it was a lost cause, too dangerous to try and reach. But as Silas looked at the boat, a spark lit in his old eyes. He thought back to his younger days, to the traps he'd set, the snares he'd woven, and the heavy pelts he'd hauled out of tricky spots. His mind began to work not on trapping animals, but on trapping the goods. He saw ropes, leverage, and the clever ways he used to outsmart nature. It was a challenge, a puzzle that only someone with his unique skills could solve. The town needed those goods, and Silas, the quiet riverman, felt a familiar pull to help, a duty that stirred deep within his bones. Begin. Silas knew he couldn't just wade into that raging water. He needed a plan, and he needed the right tools. He went back to his cabin, rummaging through old chests and dusty corners. What he found wasn't new rope, but coils of worn saddlecord, tough and strong, used for years on his horses and traps. It was frayed in places, but Silas knew how to make it hold. He began to cut and knot, his fingers, though old, still nimble and sure. He worked through the afternoon and into the twilight, the sounds of the river filling his cabin. He wasn't just making a net. He was weaving a memory, each knot a reminder of skills honed over a lifetime. As darkness fell and the first sliver of moon appeared, Silas carried his creation down to the riverbank. It wasn't a fishing net, but something much larger, a makeshift web designed to cradle heavy loads. The moonlight cast long shadows as he stretched it out, testing its strength. He had added loops and reinforced edges, turning the old saddlecord into a formidable tool. The air was cool, the river still loud, but Silas felt a quiet determination. He would use the darkness as his cover, the moon as his guide, and his own 2 hands to bring those goods home. And begin. Under the pale moonlight, Silas carefully maneuvered his small, sturdy raft, built from old timber and held together by worn ropes. The river still roared, but Silas, with his net, was like a spider in its web, working with quiet precision. He cast his woven saddlecord net towards the stranded boat, aiming for the packages still clinging to its battered deck. It took many tries, the current pulling hard, but Silas was patient. Finally, the net snagged a large, water-soaked bundle. He grunted, pulling on the ropes, his old muscles straining. The timber of his raft creaked under the weight as he slowly, carefully, dragged the first piece of cargo from the river's grasp. He repeated this task again and again, his hands raw, his back aching, but his spirit strong. Each time, the net would dip, grapple, and then Silas would haul, the rhythmic creak of the raft's timber joining the river's whispers. He worked until the first light of dawn began to peek over the eastern hills. The river, though still high, had calmed slightly, as if tired from its storm. Piles of salvaged goods lay on the riverbank, wet but safe. Silas wiped his brow, a faint smile on his lips. It was then, as he began to move the last few heavy burlap sacks further onto dry land, that he felt it. Not the softness of cloth, nor the usual shape of goods, but something hard and lumpy, sewn tightly within one of the sacks. Begin. The hard lump within the burlap sack felt strange, not like any good Silas had ever handled. Curiosity, a rare guest in his quiet life, tugged at him. He pulled out his trusty hunting knife, its blade dulled by years of use but still sharp enough for the task. Carefully, he slit open the thick fabric of the burlap sack, following the line of the lumpy shape. The wet burlap gave way with a tearing sound. What he saw inside made his eyes widen. It wasn't flour or tools or clothing, which are the usual contents of such shipments. Instead, neatly packed and wrapped in oilskin to keep them dry, were many thick stacks of money. Not just a few bills, but piles upon piles of crisp paper bound with paper bands. The money smelled faintly of river water and old paper, but it was unmistakably real. Silas carefully unwrapped one of the stacks. The numbers on the bills were large, larger than he had ever seen. He stared at the unexpected treasure, his mind racing. Why would someone hide so much money in a regular shipment, sewn into a burlap sack, and send it down the river? This was not just lost cargo. This was something secret, something that didn't want to be found. The morning sun, now fully risen, glinted off the stacks of bills, making them seem almost unreal. Begin. Silas carefully rewrapped the money, hiding it away in his cabin. He usually kept to himself, but the discovery of the hidden cash stirred something within him. He decided to make a rare trip to town, not just to see if the goods he saved were being put to good use, but to listen. He sat on a bench outside the general store, pretending to whittle a piece of wood, but his ears were wide open. He heard whispers, hushed conversations that floated on the breeze like dandelion seeds. People spoke of hard times, of taxes and debts. More and more, a name kept coming up: Judge Blackwood. The whispers grew louder, tinged with fear and anger. The judge is pushing folks out, one man muttered to another. Says their land deeds ain't right, or they owe money they don't have. A woman sighed. He's taking homes, good people's homes, just like that. Silas heard about families being told they had to leave their farms, even those that had been in their families for generations. The talk was always about Judge Blackwood, a stern man who had recently arrived in town, bringing with him a reputation for being strict and unyielding. The pieces began to click in Silas's mind. Why would someone hide so much money? And why was Judge Blackwood suddenly so keen on taking people's land? The river had given up a secret, and now the town was sharing its own. And begin. Silas walked back to his cabin, the whispers from town echoing in his mind. He looked at the stacks of money he had pulled from the river, then thought of Judge Blackwood and the families losing their homes. It all started to make terrible sense, like fitting two puzzle pieces together. The judge wasn't just being strict, he was being paid. The money, the secret shipment, was a bribe. Someone rich and powerful wanted the land that these families lived on, and Judge Blackwood was helping them get it by finding excuses to kick people out. The stacks of cash were his payment for sending innocent folks out into the cold, for breaking up communities that had been there for years. The river, in its wild storm, had not just uncovered a lost shipment. It had uncovered a wicked plan. Silas felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He was a quiet man, used to the peace of the river, but he couldn't stand by while such wrong was done. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice, about people's lives and their homes. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant stepping out of his quiet world and into the noisy, complicated affairs of men. The money in his cabin wasn't just a discovery. It was a heavy burden, a key to unlock a grave injustice. And begin. The decision weighed heavily on Silas, like a stone in his pocket. His life had always been simple, far from the troubles of town. He preferred the company of fish and river otters to the complicated ways of people. Yet, the thought of innocent families losing their homes, their livelihoods, because of a greedy judge and hidden money, gnawed at him. He couldn't just sit by. He carefully gathered the stacks of money, tucking them into a leather pouch he usually used for fishing lures. Then, with a deep breath, he walked away from his quiet cabin and towards the bustling heart of town. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building, smelling of old leather and pipe tobacco. Sheriff Brody, a big man with a kind face and tired eyes, looked up in surprise as Silas, the rarely seen riverman, walked in. Silas wasn't one for long speeches. He placed a heavy pouch on the sheriff's desk, its contents clinking softly. "Sheriff," Silas began, his voice a little raspy from disuse, "I found this, and I think it has something to do with Judge Blackwood and why folks are losing their homes." He then started to tell his tale, slowly at first, then gaining a quiet strength as he spoke of the storm, the stranded boat, and the secret hidden within the burlap. And begin. Sheriff Brody had seen many strange things in his years, but Silas the Trapper, with a pouch full of cash and a wild story, was certainly new. His eyebrows shot up when Silas first laid the money on the desk. "Silas, what in the blazes?" He started, but Silas held up a gnarled hand, a look of quiet urgency in his eyes. As Silas began to speak, his voice gaining a steady rhythm, the sheriff's initial surprise turned into focused attention. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, his gaze fixed on the old trapper. Silas spoke of the storm, the ruined bridge, and the stranded boat. He described the long night of pulling cargo from the river and the strange, hard lump he felt in the burlap. Then he spoke of cutting open the sack and finding the stacks of money. He told of his trip to town, the whispers he heard, and the chilling realization that tied the hidden cash to Judge Blackwood and the troubles of the townspeople. Sheriff Brody didn't interrupt, not once. He listened to every word, his face growing grimmer with each detail. He knew the rumors about Judge Blackwood, had heard the complaints, but without proof, his hands had been tied. Now, here was Silas, a man known for his honesty and quiet ways, laying out a story that was hard to ignore, backed by a pile of money that spoke louder than any words. And begin. Sheriff Brody knew this was big, too big for just him and Silas. He sent out word across the town and the surrounding farms. There would be a special meeting, right here in the courthouse, first thing in the morning. It wasn't a regular court day, but this was no regular matter. The news spread like wildfire, carried by nervous whispers and hopeful glances. People knew something important was happening, something that felt like a turning point. When the sun rose, the courthouse square was already filling. Wagons and horses lined the dusty streets. Farmers, their faces grim but eyes alight with a flicker of hope, stood side by side with townsfolk. Judge Blackwood arrived, looking stern as ever, but there was a hint of confusion in his eyes as he saw the unusual crowd. He was used to commanding respect, not facing a sea of questioning faces. Inside the courthouse, every seat was taken, and people stood in the aisles and by the windows, craning their necks to see. The air was thick with tension, a mix of fear and a desperate longing for justice. It felt like the old Western stories, where good and bad came face to face, and the truth would finally be laid bare. Sheriff Brody stood at the front, next to the judge's empty chair, a solemn look on his face. He nodded toward the small, quiet man in the back, Silas. It was time for the river's secret to be heard by all. And begin. A hush fell over the crowded courthouse as Sheriff Brody called for attention. His gaze swept across the faces, landing finally on Silas. "Folks," the sheriff announced, his voice echoing in the silent room, "we're here today because of a matter of great importance. Silas, the riverman, has something to say." Silas felt all eyes turn to him. His heart thumped like a trapped rabbit, and his palms felt sweaty. He was used to the quiet solitude of the river, not the piercing stares of 100 people. But he took a deep breath, remembering the faces of the families he'd heard about, the ones who stood to lose everything. He walked to the front, carrying the leather pouch, and stood beside Sheriff Brody. His voice, at first a hesitant murmur, grew stronger as he recounted his story, starting from the storm, the stranded boat, and his long night of pulling cargo. He described the moment he felt the strange lump in the burlap, the surprise of finding the stacks of money. Then, with a steady voice, he connected it all. He spoke of the whispers in town, the complaint about Judge Blackwood's rulings, and how the large sum of money could only mean one thing: a bribe. He explained that this money was meant to ensure the judge would rule against the innocent families, forcing them from their homes. As he finished, he opened the pouch, letting the stacks of money spill onto the table for all to see. And begin. As Silas finished speaking and the stacks of money lay plain for all to see, a wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the courthouse. All eyes turned to Judge Blackwood. His stern face, usually so calm and commanding, was now a mask of surprise and fear. His jaw hung slightly open, and his eyes darted from the money on the table to the expectant faces of the townspeople, then back to Silas. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound came out. He cleared his throat, his face turning a deep shade of red. This is nonsense," he stammered, but his voice lacked its usual force. "This man is a trapper, a simpleton. He knows nothing of the law." But his words rang hollow. The evidence, glittering on the table, was too strong. The whispers from the town had found their voice, and the judge had nowhere to hide. He knew Silas was a man of truth, not one to concoct elaborate lies. The oilskin wrapping, the way the money was carefully sewn into the sack, it all pointed to a deliberate secret one meant for him. His eyes fell on the river-soaked bills, and he seemed to shrink in his chair. He was caught, trapped by the quiet determination of a trapper and the unforgiving truth brought by the river. There was no denying it, no explaining it away. Judge Blackwood looked undeniably, terribly guilty. And begin. With Judge Blackwood's guilt hanging heavy in the air, undeniable and plain for all to see, Sheriff Brody stepped forward. His voice was firm as he declared, "Judge Blackwood, by the authority invested in me, you are hereby removed from your position. Justice will be served." A wave of murmurs turned into a roar. Cheers erupted from every corner of the courthouse, shaking the very timbers of the old building. People clapped, shouted, and some even cried tears of relief. The news spread quickly through the town, carried on the wind like a joyous song. The families who had been threatened with eviction, who had lived in fear of losing everything, now knew they were safe. Their homes were secure, their farms saved. The dark cloud that had hung over the town, brought by the corrupt judge, lifted as quickly as it had appeared. Judge Blackwood was led away, his head down, his grand plans ruined by a quiet trapper and a river that revealed secrets. The The people embraced each other, their faces alight with a hope they hadn't felt in a long time. They knew they had Silas to thank. He, the silent riverman, had become their unlikely hero, saving not just goods from the river, but their very way of life. The sound of their cheers followed him as he quietly slipped out of the courthouse, back towards the peace of his riverbank. End. Begin. Silas returned to his cabin by the river, leaving the joyful celebrations of the town behind. The courthouse had been loud, filled with shouts and cheers, but his home was quiet, just the way he liked it. He picked up his fishing rod, a familiar comfort in his hands, and cast his line into the calm water. The river flowed on, unbothered by the human drama that had unfolded. Though he sought no praise, Silas couldn't escape the title of hero. People in town would nod and smile at him with new respect. Children would point and whisper, "That's Silas, the man who saved our homes." He didn't change his ways, still mended his nets, still fished by moonlight, still listened to the river's whispers. But now, those whispers carried a new note, a quiet acknowledgement of his courage. He was still the riverman, but he was also the man who stood up for what was right, who used his wisdom and simple skills to expose a great wrong. The hidden money was turned over to the town, helping rebuild what the storm had damaged. Silas, the quiet trapper, continued to live his life by the water, a silent guardian of both the river's secrets and the town's justice, his bravery woven into the fabric of their shared history. End.